Right. Is everything? Is everyone
We are live.
available?
We are live now, sir.
I haven't got Mr. White up at all. I don't know whether is he available.
He hasn't rejoined yet.
Right. Right. I've got Ms. Foster, who's got her hand up. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Mr. White was in the waiting room, and I think he's just joined now.
Right. Okay, then. Yeah. And I have got Mr. Cook's hand up, but that might have been left over from previously, but I'm not sure.
So it isn't. I was just going to say that I'm more than happy to come back to discuss the matters raised in the previous session now. Oh,
yes. I'll wait. Mr. White's available. I'd just like to apologise. It was the government website was down. I don't know, Miss Debling, Mrs. Debling. I can see you. I don't know whether you're best not to have your video on, because you're not. I don't intend that you will take part in this. Thank you. Thanks. But anyway, so what I'll do is I'll resume the roundtable session, and what I'd like to do is carry on until 1 o'clock. I'll have an hour's break at 1 o'clock. Then I'm looking now at trying to get 2 sessions in this afternoon instead. I don't know whether that's going to be of any help to try and make up some time. That's assuming everything works all right again. But any comments on that, Mr. White? You?
Well, sir, I have a board meeting at 5:30, which I said I would attend, but of course the inquiry takes precedence. So if you sit at that stage, of course I will stay. So I think we probably, in view of the timescale, we probably should try and make up as much time as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit unfortunate that it was the government website that went down, and but there have been a few problems with it recently, so I'm not sure why. But I
mean, I mean, these things happen. No, you know, yeah. I mean, we've all had issues. I mean, if we do, so can I just make it clear with a free run 2 till 3:30 and then 3:45 to 5:15, basically?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at. Yes.
Okay, well, let's do that then.
I'll try and do that one, all being well. But I think I need to make up some time now. Yeah. And this round robin is taking a bit of time anyway, but I'll hopefully try and see how we get on until 1 o'clock today, and then. But so I'll go back to the round robin now, and Mr. Cook was the person who was going to address some of the points that were raised by the appellant's experts. Mr. Cook, I'll hand over to you if you can remember what happened. But I think it's fairly really stating what the concern, what the appellant was saying anyway in the evidence. Anyway, if you'd like to just say why you consider what the appellant said, what your opinion is on that, i.e. the importance of that tree and well, anyway, that's the main part, I think, in the TPO. But anyway, if you can say something on that, right?
Certainly, sir. I shall. The T43 is located at the outside of quite a gentle corner, and to my mind it provides a focal point as one looks both from the east and the west, sitting on that outside of a corner. It is one of the original pairs of trees. In terms of its visibility, I would not agree that it's only visible from 45 to 55 metres, as stated in, I think, the SJA POE. But I think obviously you're going to visit and you will form your own judgment of that. But to my mind, it's visible, 80 to 100 metres from up the road, if not more. I note Mr. Smith's photograph, plate 6, which which you've had drawn to your attention. And the viewpoint of this, I don't think is particularly representative of the avenue, as there, and this is the only place on the avenue where that occurs. And I appreciate his view is looking down towards T43, but on the north side, we have a double gap where 2 trees are missing, followed by, on the south side, 3 trees missing. I think it's important to point out that this is the only place where that level of denudation occurs. And that, if you travel down the avenue a little more from that point towards T43, the legibility of the avenue is very much picked up again and is clear. I think in the SJA POE 7 CD 7.10 in Appendix 3, they've done a very good study showing which trees are still there and which trees aren't, and I think that helps to kind of emphasize that, and whereas they may have wished to emphasize how many trees are missing, I think to the contrary, it actually shows how many are still there. And I feel that the legibility of the avenue is very clearly displayed if one, as an ordinary road user, would drive from one end to the other. It really does have so much cohesion to my mind, despite the missing trees. In my, I think it's my rebuttal, CD 726 in paragraph 5.
Sorry, I just just a minute, I'll get your.
It's a very small point, sir. My mathematical prowess was awry that day in saying that 70% of the trees were still there. It is in fact 58%. It doesn't alter my view really, in terms of here we have a 150-year-old avenue and we still have 58% of the trees. I think that the avenue very much still reads in its intended form. Moving on, in terms of T43 and where it's found, it's been asserted that the surrounding trees, there are a number of surrounding trees within, I think it was stated 30 meters. A number of those are not avenue trees, they are trees outside of that feature. And I don't feel that the removal of T43 can be justified because there are trees around it. It still is that focal point as one looks up and down the avenue. And I feel that the cohesion of that section of the avenue will be very much affected by its removal. And in addition, just because some nearby trees are taller, I don't feel that that again would negate the individual impact of T43. In terms of Mr. Jones' statement about, this is the 36th tree to be removed, what's different to the 34th or even perhaps the 37th? I think that this is where the TPO is important, because what this TPO is saying is that the avenue has significant amenity value. It has a historic context as well. And And I appreciate that KCC over time have let trees go, and planning applications have let trees go. But this is saying that this avenue really is important. We appreciate what's happened to it. And, you know, we need to halt this and try and keep this avenue. And of course, that will entail replants. And in terms of replanting, the council could not oblige KCC to replant for any reason other than if there is a TPO in force. I mean, naturally, local authorities do speak to each other, but in the context of very tight budgets, you know, we now have a position whereby we can assure that any trees that are removed for whatever reason will actually be replaced. So I think I've dealt with the cohesion and the individual significance of the tree. I would also state that T43 has a very good long-term prognosis. I think Mr. Jones in his POE 710, you know, in 4.47, he says it has a normal vitality and no evidence of imminent decline. He feels that it's likely on balance that the tree will continue to be there for another 40 years. It could be longer. It may be less. One just doesn't know. And I think the basis on which to, you know, condemn a tree that it may not live very long and, you know, things could come along that affect it, I don't think is a sound one. I think I've covered all the points there. I was hoping to be brief. To be
yeah,
helpful.
thank you. I mean, do you need Mr. Withycombe to cover anything else or not? Mr. Withycombe's got his hand up.
I would defer to Mr. Withycombe to add any weight that he feels is necessary.
Yeah, I'd like to come back on.
Is there anything on the trees? It's only the trees, the impact.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on a couple of the points raised by Mr. Smith in particular. I think the first point he made was that Appledore Road is a busy road with, and it is a busy road, or fairly busy road with all the usual street furniture and signage. But this certainly should not detract from the assessment of the avenue as a landscape and visual feature, and whether it's character defining. I think he also took you to Olivier page 115, and this of course deals with visual effects. Again, I think it's very important to distinguish between the visual contribution of T43, which Mr. Cook has touched on, and I want to take you to an image which I hope will back that view up, and the contribution of T43 to the landscape character of Appledore Road, particularly the contribution of that avenue to the character of Appledore Road. I fully agree with Mr. Cook that it remains a legible feature, the avenue, and you'll see that when you go to site, sir. I contend it's a character defining feature on Appledore Road, and it's a character defining feature on the approaches to Tenterden, and it is one that, taking on board all the points about removals and replanting, it retains, in my opinion, a strong avenue character, and T43 is an integral part of that avenue, and its removal would create a substantial gap. And if I could, so just refer, if we can, to the appendices to my proof of evidence, which is CD 718.
Yeah, I'll just get that. Right. Yeah, I've got the appendices.
So if you go to the last page, page 23, view
Additional
L40.
photographs, yes.
Yeah, view
That's
L40.
L14, yes.
Correct, thank you. Now, T43 is the tree, if you like, in the centre of that view, just in front of the white car.
Yes, yes, I've got that. Yes.
And I think that backs up Mr. Cook's point on two of Mr. Cook's points. Firstly, that the tree is because of its location on that bend, is a prominent landscape part of that avenue, and you can see the maturity at the avenue in that point. As Mr. Cook says, it is one of the original pairs that remains, and you can see the removal of that tree would create a substantial gap and would be visually prominent in that view. And again, to back up Mr. Cook, that view, in my estimation, is certainly 100 odd meters from the tree, so it is visible from quite a long distance away. And just a final point, I'm dealing with the sort of mitigation.
So, yeah, I was going to deal with the mitigation, but
we'll come back to that later. Shall I?
I was going to come back to that because I was going
Fine.
to ask what the mitigation would be from the appellant, and then you can have your
Thank you, sir.
say as to
I'll stop there then.
why you don't think that's right or not. But I think what I wanted to do explore at the moment is just the impact of the removal, really.
Yeah,
of that tree, which everyone's agreed would have to be removed for this entrance.
And it's the fact that it would be irreplaceable. That's it. It's gone.
So that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, is there anything that Mr. Coombe would like to add on that before I on to what's been said, as he's representing the consultants that Tenterden Council, Mr. Coombs?
Thank you, sir. I have no comments to make on that particular tree, and I'm not advised of any comments to bring forward to you.
Right, thank you. So I'd just like to hand over to the appellant just to see what the response to that is, and then I'll move on to, then the appellant can then highlight some mitigation measures. But so who would like to respond? Is it Mr. Jones? Yes.
I'll go first if I may, sir.
Can you hear me okay? Too long on this, because no. I mean I've heard both sides of the story, and like I say, I can go and have a look anyway, and make my own judgment on this. But so I've got an idea that you certainly don't seem to fully agree with the importance of that tree. But anyway, if you'd like to say anything else on this. Yeah.
Just a few brief points then, please. The point that the tree is a focal point on the corner, there is a degree of subjectivity in that. And I agree that this may be something which you yourself will judge at the time of the site visit. The second point, Mr. Cook says that he doesn't agree that the tree is only visible from 45 to 55 metres. We have to be very careful when we're saying, is a tree visible or not? This is something which I find I have to train our surveyors carefully in, because you have to be specific about what is visible. Is it the entire tree? Is it just the trunk and none of the crown? Is it a percentage perhaps of the crown? Is it no trunk and just crown? And from where? So the visibility of the tree has to be more than something that is generalized. It has to be specific. And specifically, I think you'll find when you go to site that the full tree can only really be seen from 45 to 55 metres away. The further away you get... Can I
just interrupt it? Because I was led to this photograph, L14, which I think has been used in a few different proofs, or certainly I've seen this photograph in a few different places, or one similar to it. And that tree, has been identified in front of the white car. And I think Mr. Withicombe was saying this was about 100 metres away. So, and it's on the outside of the bend. So what is, you've probably seen this photograph anyway, haven't you? So
in Mr. Smith's proof.
Well, it's in the
Yes.
appendices, at the end of the appendices to his proof, but I have a feeling it's a similar photo that I've seen in other
Yes.
evidence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The point is, you can't see the entire crown of that tree from there, and as Mr. Smith himself said, removing that tree, you're not going to have a huge impact on the skyline. In fact, I think it may change very little, and in many viewpoints, not at all. So,
So this is how you're judging it then?
That's how I'm judging it. We have to look at it from that point of view.
Right.
Okay. The next point I'll just bring up is that Mr. Cook said that no doubt in our avenue plan, which was appended to our my proof of evidence, which is 7.10, he said no doubt we were hoping to show the number of trees that had been removed. Sorry to be a pedant, but no, that's not what we were trying to show. We were trying to show the full situation for your benefit, sir, so that you could see how many had been removed, how many have been retained, and how many off-site trees there are that contribute to the arboricultural character of the road. The next one, may I move on, or are you?
No, I just so your appendix one. I'm just looking for that one.
7.10.
7.1. All right. Yeah. Seven, 1, 10.
Appendix 3.
Appendix 3, yes, I've got appendix 3. That's it.
So
that's the one you're referring to that one, yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
So that was intended to give a full picture of the state of play, and the interpretation of it is down to you, sir.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Right, thank you.
Okay, just two more. Mr. Cook said that the TP, and forgive me, Mr. Cook, if I didn't get this entirely accurate, but I'm pretty sure you said the TPO says the avenue has significant amenity value. That brings me back to the point I made earlier, sir, that a tree should be made the subject of a TPO if it has value. It doesn't give additional value to a tree. Just because the LPA has decided these trees are of value doesn't necessarily mean they are. So just to reiterate.
I think what the point was being raised is that by being TPO'd, it puts more emphasis on replacing them. Is that what was trying to be asked?
And that is a good point. That's what he said afterwards, and that is a good point.
Yeah.
It means that they can enforce KCC to replace trees that they remove.
So you agree on that, yeah?
Patently, KCC have not been regularly replacing trees that have been removed in the past.
Although, to be fair, they weren't, these ones weren't TPO'd in the past, were they?
That's right. So the situation should now change because they are TPO'd. Ashford can enforce replacement planting from now on.
Right.
And
any other points you wish to raise?
I'd just like to raise one that Mr. Cook didn't raise, actually. If I can draw your attention, please, to my proof of evidence section, which is 7.10, section 4.6.
So section
4.6, which you'll find, sir, on page 33.
Yeah. Yes, I've got that.
Yes, I think it is worth reminding that this proposed access was looked at very carefully. It was clear from the outset that an access to this site, to Appledore Road, would not be achievable without some tree loss. And so 3 or 4 options were explored, 3 of them seriously, as you can see in that section 4.6. And we came down to the most, what I might call, tree-friendly option, being where it is, because it only removed 1 highway tree, and it also avoided any harm coming to 2 large oaks that are on either side. That's trees 46 and 39. Now, those oaks are large specimens, and whilst they're not avenue trees, they are quite an arboricultural presence in that area of the street, or the road, should I say, and they are of long-term potential. I would suggest of longer-term potential than the horse chestnut. So I think that we have to look at the loss of this tree in the parameters of the fact that we couldn't get a site access here without the loss of at least 1 tree, 1 avenue tree.
Yes, I think it's understood that, I think that's all basically been agreed, as far as I'm aware, that this is the most appropriate location for a site access. So it's just that this site access does remove that tree, and that's been agreed as well.
That's right.
So it's really not, I think the main purpose of this is just to look at the importance of the removal of that tree on the impact in the area, impact visually and on the character. So I think that's what we're looking at. But anyway, thank you very much. So what I'd like to move on to.
Can I just, sorry, before I go, can I just make one last note? Before we adjourned, to use a Trumpian phrase, I think I misspoke. I certainly, I misidentified in my speed to tell you about the young tree T17. I'm fairly sure I told you it was an oak. Of course, that was incorrect. It is a lime, as you will see from the avenue tree schedule at appendix 2 of my proof of evidence.
No, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've got Mr. Cook's hand up actually, but I don't want to dwell much longer on this because I know that you disagree, but and I've got the evidence. I just wanted to find out exactly where we stood. But Mr. Cook, there's Mr. Smith as well. But sorry, but there was Mr. Cook had his hand up, but I don't know whether that means is he there?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Mr.
Yes,
Cook.
sir.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
If I could just come back very briefly on one point that I think is particularly important. In terms of, and I must say, I do commend the SJA Avenue plotting. It was a good piece of work. But in terms of the visibility of what part of a tree may be visible, I take Mr. Jones' point. But in this case, part of the crown is visible. and a very substantial trunk or stem. And this vertical feature, I think, really helps define the character of the avenue through there. And if one looks at an avenue, there's no doubt that those vertical stems of an avenue do have great visual weight. That's it. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And there's Mr. Smith's got his hand up. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, sir. Hopefully the new improved Mr. Smith with audio facilities. Hopefully you can hear me.
Wait, actually, you are much clearer. So that's something that the Germans managed to put right.
I've reset the entire system and, as you can see, put on a microphone.
Right,
So I've only a couple of brief points I would like to make in response to the points that have been raised, if that's okay.
Yeah, yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Point one is in relation to view L14. I don't know if you still have that. That's in
Yes, I have got
Mr.
that
Withercombe's appendices. And
Yeah.
one thing I would say, sir, is, and this may sound a bit facetious, obviously, if you put something at the center of a view, then it will become central to that view. And one thing I would say here is that we are on the right-hand side of a road, at the end of a drive, looking towards T43. So obviously our point of view would be different if we were doing what most car drivers, for example, would be doing, and that's obviously driving on the left-hand side of the road. Now, I freely and fully accept that there will be other perspectives from which you will see this tree. My point is simply that you will also see other trees as you carry on along this road. Secondly, the point was made by Mr. Withercombe that the wider context of traffic, the road, signage is not relevant. Well, of course it is in terms of making landscape judgments, because those are all features. I'm not going to go on at length about that because that's more of a landscape point and this is a tree session, but I just wanted to make that clear. When judging the prominence or indeed the effect of removing a feature such as T43, I mentioned before, I mentioned page 115 of Glivia 3. To be clearer, sir, I am specifically referring, as Mr. Withercombe correctly states, to the judgment of the magnitude of visual effects, paragraph 6.39. I'm conscious that Mr. Jones said there's a degree of subjectivity. He's right, of course, there is a degree of subjectivity. However, we have some clear guidance here. 6.39, first bullet point states, the scale of the change in the view with the respect to the loss or addition of features. So when you're on site, you will make a judgment. If this tree goes, what is the scale of the change in the view? And then you will notice in the next bullet point, the degree of contrast or integration of any new features or changes in the landscape with the existing or remaining landscape elements. So that's really important because that goes to the heart of if this tree is removed and if there are other mature trees that are seen in the vicinity of that tree, what is the degree of change that would be experienced? So that's my point, sir, in terms of how we should judge that visual change. And finally, because that is a visual point, can I just point out that when we're making judgments about character effects, those are set out on page 90 of Glivia 3, 90 and 91. And again, they talk about the, if we look at paragraph 5.49, they talk about the extent of existing landscape elements that will be lost and the geographical area over which those landscape effects will be felt. So that means, sir, in the context of the entire avenue, one tree will be lost, and that loss will be visible over an area. And I appreciate that there's some difference between us on this, Mr. Jones says 30 to 50 metres in either direction. The council says something longer. But the point, sir, is that in the context of the entire avenue, those character effects using Clivia 3 are highly localised. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Right, what I'd like to next do is look at the mitigation that's going to be put in or proposed to be put in, and this is really on. I mean, I've put a few headings, but one of the mitigations. Well, it's the replacement tree provision, really, isn't it? The mitigation. But if I don't know whether Mr. Jones is it who's the best person to highlight the mitigation and why. Oops, why this will be just trying to sort things out. Why this would be able to mitigate and how much mitigation it would provide. And how it would be carried out, really. So if we can look at that, and really there was concern about the maturity of the mitigation trees and how much impact they'd have, etc. So if you can just highlight all of that under mitigation. I mean, there was concern. Actually, I did put carbon, but it's carbon capture really on that. But I think there were concern about loss of carbon capture and things like that, but I'm not sure whether that's the appropriate forum to do it here about that. But anyway, how much mitigation will be provided and how it will be provided and how significant that will be. Mr. Jones, are you the right person to highlight that?
Well, I can start at least. Maybe Mr. Smith may want to come in looking at the wider aspects again, the more landscape aspects. Mitigation for this tree is going to be supplied in two ways, really. One of them is going to be a caveat payment. That's a payment of £34,000 to be made to Kent County Council to allow it to plant a replacement tree, or more likely, replacement trees. Now, I fully accept that there is no requirement for the Kent County Council to use that money to spend it on replacement trees close to tree 43, or indeed on the avenue. But the appellant is willing to spend that money as a means of funding replacement planting in mitigation. We also should look, though, at the mitigation supplied by the planting on the entire site, because there is a lot of planting planned on the entire site, and there will be 20 or so new street and hedgerow trees planted, 61 new orchard trees, 1,100 linear meters of native hedgerow will be planted. This is all in Mr. Smith's proof, so he can tell you more about that. Another way in which there may be some mitigation, but this is not, I accept, an immediate or a large amount of mitigation, is simply that by taking that tree out, more light and more groundwater and nutrients will be available to the trees around that are remaining, particularly the oaks 39 and 46 that I mentioned before, and so they should be able to grow better, but that is a minor point. Do you want me to go on and talk about carbon capture while I'm on, sir?
Yeah, you well, I think that's been raised. I'm not sure whether by the council, but it's certainly raised by other people anyway.
I think, yes, Mr. Cook raised it, sir, in his, was it in his proof or is in rebuttal? He will be able to tell you, but he made the point that the removal of this tree will remove carbon. Trees, as you know, sequester and store carbon, and if you fell them, that carbon sequestering is no longer available, and the carbon is tied up in the tree. If you look at my rebuttal, I have addressed this at paragraphs 2.1.18 onwards. And I have demonstrated, I have estimated the amount of carbon that tree 43 may be storing.
So 2.1.18. 2.1.18. Right. Yes. 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 I got that.
And this runs through to 2.1.26, in fact, because I also talk about other ecosystem services that the tree provides, which Mr. Cook also referred to. It is clear that we may have around about, and this is only an estimate, 4,500 kilograms of carbon in this tree. And because young trees store very little carbon, it's not possible to replace that all at once. There is a time element involved. You'll see from my evidence that, in my view, if the CAVAT money was replaced, what was spent on new trees in the avenue, say 36 of them, then we may be in a situation where that carbon is replaced after 25 to 30 years by the new trees. But then if we set this against the amount of proposed tree planting against the whole site, then this would be replaced very quickly. And I should point out that the felling of tree 43 would only mean a 2% reduction in the amount of carbon that's currently being stored by the avenue. Again, this is an estimate. We almost have to chop a tree down and weigh it to provide you with more than an estimate. Mm-hmm. So we can only do that after tree 43 is gone. So, and the other point to make is that this carbon doesn't get necessarily turned into carbon dioxide, as I say in my proof at 2.1.23. If you don't burn the tree or bury it, which is even worse than burning it, but you chip it and use it as mulch, or you leave it on site as a big trunk, then the carbon stays in the tree and it only comes out very slowly, and some of that goes into the soil, which it then enriches. So my view is that the carbon issue is a very minor one, sir. I know it's a hot topic these days, but this is not going to lead to a huge difference.
Right, thank you. Is there anything that Mr. Smith wants to add on to that about mitigation before I move over to the...
Just a couple of minor points, if I may, sir. First point is that I am aware of a letter from Kent County Council's Highways Department dated the 20th of May 2021. I refer to this in my proof at paragraph 140 on page 33. I just wanted to flag this up. It does, as Mr. Jones has said, includes a provision for £34,213, and it specifically says to fund additional tree planting within the vicinity of the site. So I think it's important. No, we don't know the specifics of a scheme. We don't have something that's agreed. We can't have that in place at the moment, of course. But we do know that there is a significant amount of money that has been specifically allocated to deal with replacement trees in that vicinity. And obviously, in terms of quantum of replacement planting, we don't know what that could be, but certainly £34,000 would certainly pay for the establishment and management of 35, 36 trees. I would imagine, and I have said at paragraphs 142 and 143 of my proof, page 34, I would imagine that normal procedure would be that those replacement trees would be heavy standards, and that they would therefore be 3 to 3.5 meters tall when planted. And if that is the case, as I have said in paragraph 143, using guidance from the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment about tree growths, we can assume conservatively that they would be able to achieve a height of 5 meters 5 years after planting, 7.5 meters 10 years after planting, and 10 meters 15 years after planting, assuming, of course, that they're being looked after well. So in terms of scale, I would argue that these become noticeable features in the streetscape at a relatively early stage after planting. And when I say early, in LVIA terms, short term is defined as something which is before 15 years, sorry. And again, going back to my timescales there, I was talking something 10 meters tall, 15 years after planting. Thank you, sir. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll move over to Mr. Cook again, maybe. I don't know whether Mr. Cook's first, and just to say something on this mitigation and why. Well, I think you were going to say something on the mitigation anyway, but you can now say it after you've heard what the mitigations and proposals are likely to be.
Thank you, sir. Yes. I think that there is a distinction between mitigation and compensation. It may not be a semantic point, because as the council and our view in the removal of T43, we don't believe it can be mitigated. It will take several years for trees to give the amenity value that T43 currently has, and I appreciate the carbon point. So this is something that I think bears consideration. T43 cannot be immediately mitigated for. In terms of the proposals, I would draw your attention, sir, to the email in my rebuttal, CD 7.26, Appendix 5, where Kent County Council advised that they hadn't received any approach regarding the exact details of the scheme. And I know that both Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones have alluded to this. And I feel that given the importance of T43 and the avenue as a whole, that really something should have been fleshed up by now. What we have is an avenue with probably service runs in it, and I'm not convinced that the feasibility of delivery has been entirely established. It could be possible to deliver the 34 or however many trees, but we're not sure of this yet. And given that I think everyone knows the importance of T43 and the planning decision, that really this should have formed part of the wider exploration and offer. In terms of carbon, I commend Mr. Jones on such a thorough piece of work, and it would be good to see that in other applications up front. 2% of the avenue, that's 1/50th of the avenue's bulk. It's not inconsiderable. And as Mr. Jones pointed out, carbon capture is an important thing, and we really need to look at this in terms of when we remove trees, what exactly we're removing in terms of the wider environment, because all of these small values tend to add up. What I would say in terms of mitigation planting and carbon capture on the wider development site and the proposals for planting there are, we would expect that anyway from any development proposal, that there would be a good amount of replanting that would hopefully offset the development in terms of providing all of those long-term ecosystem benefits and carbon capture. But I think that's an aside, that really what is provided on the avenue is more of the focus here, and losing it from the avenue and saying, well, we're going to provide other benefits on the site is not, it's missing the point very slightly, I think. I also feel that in terms of amenity value, the trees, when they go in, they will have a very small amenity value. They will be, just about visible as one drives past in the car, but they will take quite some time to have that significant amenity value. And it's not going to be instant. And this is, the council's contention in terms of being able to mitigate the loss of T43 is the loss of a very large mature tree cannot be mitigated immediately. There really will be an impact. I think that's covered everything, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Anything from Mr. Withicombe, or is that?
No, I think Mr. Cook has largely sort of stolen my thunder and picked up most of the points. But I think the judgment on this depends to a large extent, on the way we put on the contribution of that tree to the character, appearance, and the visual effects of that removal on the character and appearance of that avenue. And yeah, that's irreparably lost. If that tree is removed, and you agree with us that it contributes to such a level of degree to the character and appearance of the avenue, and the importance of the avenue, as we say, as a character defining feature. If one allows that tree to be removed, that's it, it's gone forever, and that part of the avenue is damaged forever. So I think that's perhaps the only one point I would make. I don't contest any of the information put forward by Mr. Smith there.
Okay, thank you. Anyone, would someone like to reply to that before I move on to to the next part of the agenda.
If I may, sir, just briefly. Mr. Cook says that removal can't be mitigated. Of course, that's at odds with the reason for refusal that says removal can't be adequately mitigated. Slightly different thing. And in view of the evidence that we've presented, both Mr. Smith and I think we should take into account the fact that this is not a tree in a location where a large amount of mitigation is actually needed. Mitigation should be proportional. And in respect of the payment, which would allow for 35 to 36 trees to be planted, may I point out that this would be a replacement ratio of 36:1. Based on the fact that only 21 trees of the 35 trees that have already been removed have been replaced, that is a replacement ratio of 0.6:1. So this is a considerable difference. And Mr. Cook also said that it's unknown whether we could actually plant trees in Appledore Road or whether Kent County Council could. Well, we do know something about that because there are service plans which can be seen at, just lost them here. They are here. I'll tell you where they are at the moment. They're in the RSK report at, and I'm just trying to find them. I had them a moment. Here we are, sorry. They are in, no, I have lost them. They're in the RSK report, CD 1.7, I think. Tell me if I'm wrong. I just had them on screen and they've just disappeared, and I don't know why. I just had that reference there. The services that run down that road are considerable. There is gas, there is electricity, there is telecoms, there are sewers, and there's water. The water and the gas and the sewers all run down within the road, so they shouldn't be a constraint. The electricity runs along the southern side of the road, so that is clearly a constraint on planting on the southern side. And then there are telecoms on both sides of the road. But by overlaying those plans, you can see that there are places, and quite a lot of them, where tree planting would not be constrained by services. But that would be a detail that could be looked at a reserved matters stage. And indeed would be down to Kent County Council. That's all I have to say on that. So,
right, thank you. Right, anything else anyone wants to say on T43 before I move on to T381? Right, in that case, I mean, like I say, I will be able to go out and have a look. So in terms of this next tree, I think it's been agreed that it's classed as an ancient tree in terms of how it is, the age and size. So just like to ask the council really, and as to why this tree is so important. I mean, I know an ancient tree is pretty important because it's protected, and you shouldn't damage an ancient tree really, and just really. So if I can go on to Mr. Cook, really to see how that's tree is going to be damaged, and what sort of damage, and whether it's actually going to be of any real harm, bearing in mind the evidence that's been given by the appellant on this tree. So, so Mr. Cook, I think it's, like I say, it's been agreed that it is an important tree in terms of keeping it as an ancient tree. So it's all so that has been agreed. So it's really whether that tree will be kept, or whether the measures that are being proposed will make sure that the tree is kept. And what are your concerns, Mr. Cook?
So I would say that before considering all of this, there's a really important principle at stake, and that lies within the standing advice, which is CD 5.8, and obviously that's backed by MPPF paragraph 180. In the buffer zone, within the standing advice, it advises that ancient trees are exceptionally valuable, and within there it provides some measure of varying how the buffer zone is approached, and I know that myself and Mr. Jones disagree about the interpretation of the standing advice. And I think that this is particularly key because within the standing advice, it mentions that the size and type are variables, but very explicitly, it does not say that the shape is a variable. Also, within it, it says that larger buffer zones may be appropriate, but it doesn't say that smaller buffer zones are appropriate. And whilst I would imagine that Mr. Jones would contend that the buffer zone is not smaller by virtue of the shape embodying the square meterage that the buffer zone would have if it was circular, that the compromise on this shape is quite simply allowing a pitch to be constructed where it shouldn't be, because the buffer zone, if it was centered on the tree, it would preclude the development in that particular form with the structure over on the other side and the pitch oriented the way it is. So I really do give great weight to that in my argument, in that the buffer zone should be centralized. In terms of British Standard 5837, which I believe is CD 5.7, explicitly within there, in paragraph 7.4, it says that no construction is recommended within the RPA of a veteran tree. And one can take it that within BS 5837, that the terms ancient and veteran are pretty synonymous, given that it doesn't mention ancient trees at all. So that's very clear. Yes, it's a recommendation, but this isn't statute. So, you know, it's not in law, it's only a recommendation, and it can't be anything more than that with its greatest weight. And I think within our proof of evidences, we've disagreed as to how the word should is applied within the standing advice. And in my understanding of the word should is that it's an obligation. It's not could, it should. And I think that's really quite clear. And again, standing advice is not statute. So the language that it uses, I would imagine is measured, and that's why the word should is used. In terms of the pitch construction, we do have a pitch within a buffer zone, which I do not think sits within the standing advice. And I would say, just let me find my notes. That the work that SJ did in terms of having the routes mapped was excellent, and it did give a picture. But what we see there is that routes are extending out to beyond the 12-metre distance that the buffer zone would afford, and certainly a centralised route protection area of about 9 metres, certainly plenty of routes within there. And again, we come back to a buffer zone. The word buffer, I think, you know, when I've variously looked it up, it means keeping two things apart. It doesn't mean the buffer zone is there to limit the incursions. It's to keep two things apart. And this is what the buffer zone would do in this case, is we can see that there are some routes extending quite a long way out, and it might be contended that these routes are quite small and could readily regrow if anything happened to them, but they are there. So what we're trying to do is keep the two things apart in the development and the tree. And without the buffer zone being centralized, this does not occur. So there would be planing off of the turf layer to 50 millimeters, so I believe, and an overburden of soil, which I think is around 500 millimeters, which does change how the tree will respond to those particular environmental factors. Did you want me to cover, while I'm here, the impact of the use as well, sir?
Yeah, I think you might as well, actually.
Yes,
I think we, yeah, otherwise we just keep going backwards and forwards. I think we might as well cover all of these, yeah.
Indeed. Mm-hmm. I know it's said that it was felt that the pitch would be low intensity use, and in Lonsdale's CD 5.9, that was, I can't remember where, in perhaps the proof of evidence of Simon Jones, they cited that Lonsdale found it acceptable for very low intensity use within a RPA or buffer zone was acceptable. And I think it mainly framed it in an agricultural context in that particular paragraph of Lonsdale's. But to my mind, this is not going to be very low intensity use. Looking at the program for maintenance, we have 40 cuts, and I appreciate you may use a lighter mower, but this is still 40 cuts. We've got 4 fertilizer applications, we've got herbicide, we've got aeration. You know, all of these things are adding up, to my mind, to something beyond low intensity use. I know it's contended as well that the ground is already a bit compacted from the grazing, but you know, the grazing, I believe, is in a totally different order of intensity to a well-maintained sports pitch. That concludes my statement on that.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to, I mean, I'm assuming that the loss is out of the question, really.
Absolutely.
Right, so just I'll move over to Mr. Jones then on that, who seems to have done a lot of work on this.
Thank you, sir. Well, if we follow your agenda here, I will just make some brief comments. Your first one was the importance of the tree. And as Mr. Cook has pointed out, NPPF and Standing Advice both call ancient trees an irreplaceable habitat. So it's important because of that. But of course, not all veteran trees are the same as each other. Not all ancient trees are the same as each other. And this tree has differences. This is not a large, long-lived tree that has grown and never been cut back. Unlike some of the veteran and indeed the ancient oak on the site, this is a tree which at some stage in its lifespan has been cut down to ground level or possibly collapsed or something like that. If you look in my proof of evidence under section 5.3, which is titled Recent History, page 41, on the succeeding pages, you'll see a series of 5 images, aerial photographs showing...
Sorry, can I just 5
Yes.
point...
Sorry, going too fast. 5.3.
Yeah, I've got 5.3,
Yeah.
which is recent history, yes.
That's right. If you read that section and you see the 5 images there, you can see the up-to-date crown of the tree on image 1, which is in April 2020. And then if you look at the further images, you'll see the crown in 2003, smaller. In 1990, smaller still, slightly. In 1960, very small, hard to distinguish from surrounding hedgerow specimens. And then back to 1940 in image 5 on page 45, pretty certainly no tree there at the time. Now, this is consistent with the nature of the tree, which has 7 main stems and another 12 subsidiary stems, 19 in all. So the evidence is indicative that this is not a veteran tree entirely. It is a tree that was cut down. It was probably managed as part of the hedge, but that management seems to have ceased after the war. And so it has regrown. Because of that, its roots are likely to have heavily retracted, as I've pointed out in my proof of evidence. Therefore, they're not going to be as extended as a normal veteran or ancient tree's roots might be. On top of that, of course, this is not an oak or beech. It's not a tree of large potential size. Field maple or hedge maple, as the Americans call it, only usually reaches about 15 meters in height. Exceptions to that, 1 or 2 trees do grow taller, but mostly in this sort of situation, they're not big trees. And not being big trees, their roots don't extend as much as the species of tree that we normally think of as might be veterans: oaks, beech, sweet chestnut, etc. So because of that, it made me wonder, well, where are the roots of this tree? And it's clear that Mr. Cook is depending very heavily in his evidence on what the Standing Advice says about buffer zones and what the British Standard says about root protection areas. So I'd like to point out a couple of things, please, about those. if I may. First of all, root protection areas. A root protection area, the British Standard, it defines, and you have the reference, sir, don't you, as a layout design tool indicating the minimum area around a tree deemed to contain sufficient roots and rooting volume to maintain the tree's viability. Now, why do we have root protection areas? Why do we have veteran tree buffers? This is because simply we can't see the roots. We don't have crown protection areas because we can see the crown of the tree. We can see if it's asymmetrical. We can see how tall it is. We can see how wide it is. We can see how dense it is. But with roots, we can't do that. So because it's quite expensive to try and be precise or accurate about the extent and density of roots, we normally use root protection areas to give us a rough idea. Because of this, because we are applying a root protection area in ignorance of actual root disposition, as the roots aren't visible, it doesn't necessarily mean that an incursion into a root protection area will lead to the deterioration or loss of the tree. But I do accept it does put a burden of proof on whoever is arguing this to demonstrate that it doesn't. Now, 5.8b, core document 5.8b, which is the current guidance on ancient trees and veteran trees, published the 14th of January 2022, so very recent. Gives us guidance for what we should do to try and protect veteran trees. And it states in there, and unfortunately its paragraphs aren't numbered, but it states on there, on the, maybe I can tell you which page it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, on the 7th page, the pages aren't numbered either. It gives buffer zone recommendations. Now, for those of you who may have come across the British Standard for British standards will know, there are 3 types of standards. There are guidance, there is recommendations, and there is a code of practice. And I take issue with Mr. Cook when he says the word should is an obligation. The word should typically goes with a recommendation, whereas the word must is what usually goes with a code of practice or an obligation. So I'm afraid I disagree with his view that the word should implies an obligation. I don't consider it does. Are you still with me, Mr. Inspector? Or have I lost you? I think I've lost you.
I think you're right.
I think he's disappeared again, hasn't he?
Ladies and gentlemen, it does appear that he has lost his connection again. I will see what the case officer says. The case officer is going to call the inspector, see if we can get him reconnected. I do apologise again for this inconvenience. I'm sure that the planning inspector are doing their best to try and get their Wi-Fi working as well as it can. The inspector has lost Wi-Fi connection, so he has requested that we adjourn this session until 1400 hours today. That's 2 o'clock. This session will now be adjourned.